Hello there, and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where curiosity settles in gently and science becomes something you can listen to without hurrying through any of it. Tonight, we're taking a slow walk into oceans that existed long before anything familiar touched their surface. Not the seas you know from beaches or documentaries or memories of childhood summers, but waters that carried animals so large and so confident in their own surroundings that the scale of life back then feels almost unreal at first glance. These were oceans ruled by giant sharks, predators much larger than anything swimming today. Their world was wide, warm and restless, and everything that lived in it had to learn how to move through a sea with hunters of extraordinary size. Before we go deeper into that world, I'm curious where you're listening from tonight. Maybe you're near a coast, or somewhere far from the ocean entirely. Maybe it's late and you're winding down, or maybe you're listening in a quiet moment during your day. Whatever the time is for you and whatever the weather is outside your window, I hope this becomes a comfortable space to rest your thoughts. If you find yourself enjoying this slow drift through science, or if it helps you relax even a little, I'd be grateful if you liked the video or subscribed. It helps this small corner reach others who might also want a peaceful place to learn about something enormous and distant without any rush. Now, since we're going into a topic that stretches far back into Earth's history, take a moment to settle your mind. There's no need to follow anything quickly. These oceans moved slowly, their creatures lived slow by our standards, and the time we're stepping into is far removed from anything like clocks or schedules. So let's ease ourselves into this. Imagine you're standing somewhere quiet where you can actually listen. It could be a shoreline, it could be your living room, it could be a memory. The place doesn't matter. What matters is that you can picture a moment where things move without pressure, and you can let your attention drift at its own pace. The oceans of the past were not shaped by the same currents, temperatures, or coastlines we know now. Continents were arranged differently. The climate was consistently warm in many periods, allowing marine life to grow into forms and sizes that feel almost excessive to us. When you think of a shark today, you might picture something fast, sleek and dangerous, but still manageable in size. A great white, perhaps. But the waters we're exploring hosted animals far bigger, including the famous giant shark often called the megalodon. This predator lived millions of years ago and reached lengths that make modern sharks look small. Yet the ocean wasn't only about size. It was an entire living system with layers of interaction, steady food chains, wandering animals, deep trenches and bright shallow regions that supported enormous life. But before we talk about those creatures, it helps to understand the environment they lived in. The water carried more warmth. The sea levels were higher. The coasts were broader. The ecosystems were rich in prey, from early whales to large fish that travelled in groups big enough to support predators of towering scale. Even the colour of the water in certain areas may have been different depending on nutrients, sediments, and the presence of microscopic life. The ocean wasn't an empty blue backdrop. It was busy and crowded in its own ancient way. To imagine that world, you don't need to force anything. Just let each detail settle in as it arrives. Picture yourself drifting near the surface. There's light above you, strong and steady. It reaches deeper than today in many regions because the warm, wide oceans could remain clearer when conditions allowed. You're not rushing downward or looking for anything specific. You're simply floating along in a world that formed long before humans walked anywhere. You might see shadows that don't match anything from modern seas, shapes you don't recognize, movements that seem slower or heavier than what you're used to. The animals back then were shaped by a different set of pressures. Their bones, their muscles, their habits, all formed in an environment where power and size mattered in ways that feel unusual now. And it's in this place, drifting without hurry, that the presence of a giant shark makes the most sense. In today's oceans, a large predator must stay relatively lean and efficient because food density has changed, temperatures vary more drastically, and prey populations aren't the same. But back then, the amount of available food, especially large marine mammals, allowed predators to evolve into enormous sizes. These animals didn't dominate every corner of the sea, but they controlled enough of it that their presence shaped the movement and behaviour of other species. Their reign wasn't constant across millions of years without interruption, but there were long stretches of time where they were among the top hunters of the marine world. While you're picturing this, try not to imagine sudden attacks or dramatic scenes from movies. Think instead of a creature moving steadily through water that carried fewer restrictions on size. It didn't need to rush every moment. It simply existed in a world that matched its scale. There was room for it to swim, room for it to hunt, room for it to follow migration paths that stretched across warm oceans. Even the idea of territory feels different here. The sea wasn't broken up by climate zones the same way it is now. Warmth allowed life to spread across wide distances, and that meant giant predators could travel far without encountering the temperature boundaries that limit modern species. As you float further into this environment, you might start noticing smaller details. Schools of fish that don't resemble anything living today. Early forms of whales that move differently, with body shapes that seem unfamiliar. Groups of rays gliding over the seafloor in ways that would look strange to modern divers. Coral and plant life that built structures unlike what you'd see on any reef today. The ocean was full of life, and every part of it, from the smallest organisms to the largest predators, played a role in keeping everything stable. The giant sharks were part of a larger system, not isolated monsters. They fit into a chain of interactions that started with tiny plankton, and rose through layers of fish, reptiles and mammals. Their world was rich enough to support them without the sharp imbalances we often associate with ancient megafauna. If you listen to this quietly enough, you might even sense how calm the ocean felt at times. For all its dangers, it wasn't chaos. It was just another version of life on Earth, where everything made sense in its own way. Thinking about these oceans can feel overwhelming at first because the scale is so different. But if you let yourself move through it slowly, it becomes easier to picture. Not through dramatic scenes, but through simple details. Water that stays warm, coasts that stretch farther, animals travelling in groups larger than anything we see today, sharks cruising for long distances without needing to compete with their modern counterparts. It's a world that favoured size in ways our planet no longer does. And somewhere in this environment you begin to understand how these sharks could become so large. It wasn't magic or exaggeration or impossible evolution. It was simply the result of conditions that sustained big animals. If there is enough food, enough space, and few limitations, size becomes an advantage. The oceans encouraged this for long periods, and the creatures living there responded accordingly. They weren't trying to impress any future species. They were just living within the rules of their time. As you settle into this picture, there's no need to hurry to the next part. Just hold on to the idea of an ocean that shaped animals through abundance instead of restriction. A sea that carried warmth far across its surface. A world where giant sharks felt natural because everything around them supported growth on that scale. And as we move forward, we'll look at what those giants actually were, how they behaved and what their oceans demanded of them, without rushing to conclusions or forcing any imagery. This is a long story, and we're just beginning to drift through it. The oceans that carried the largest sharks in history were nothing like the ones we swim in today. When people imagine these ancient waters, they often picture something dramatic or chaotic, but the truth is that much of this world moved at a steady pace. The vastness alone shaped everything that lived in it, from the smallest drifting organisms to the immense predators that passed through its depths. To understand how those giants lived, it helps to picture not just their size, but the environment that supported them. An environment built over millions of years under conditions that rarely match anything we see now. As you ease into the idea of these oceans, try to think of them without modern coastlines. Continents were arranged differently. Sea levels were higher in many periods. Large stretches of shallow water spread across regions that today stand above sea level. Even the shapes of the basins themselves were different. Instead of narrow gulfs, closed-off seas and sharply defined boundaries, these older oceans had longer sweeps of water where warm currents could travel more freely. The world had fewer cold barriers. That alone helped life expand into bigger forms, because warm water supports faster growth and larger populations of prey. The creatures that drifted through these waters did not live in isolation. The giants people remember today, like Megalodon and the other large prehistoric sharks, moved through ecosystems that were thick with marine mammals. Early whales were plentiful and often travelled in groups. Many of them lacked the defences their modern relatives have. They were heavy, slow, and still adapting to a life spent entirely in the water. For a giant predator, these animals created a steady source of food. Because they lived in such numbers, the sharks that hunted them did not have to spread themselves thin across thousands of miles searching for a meal. There were long routes where prey was consistently available. This created a rhythm to the movement of these sharks that differs from the behaviour of most large predators today. Instead of short bursts of energy or frantic chases, these animals likely spent long stretches cruising through warm water. Their size meant they burned energy slowly. Their prey moved in ways that didn't always require sudden attacks. A slow, steady approach often gave them the advantage. The ocean, shaped by warmth and abundance, allowed them to drift through it with confidence. If you imagine looking out into such a sea, what you'd notice first isn't violence or speed. You'd notice space, an enormous amount of it. The horizon would stretch without interruption. Beneath the surface, the water would seem endless in every direction. The sense of a room would be overwhelming compared to modern oceans, where many areas are crowded with human activity. The world of the giant sharks had no shipping lanes, no noise from engines, no chemical disruptions, and no nets. Everything inside those waters behaved according to natural patterns that had existed long before the first giant predators appeared. The fish and marine mammals living at that time followed migrations that depended on temperature and food availability. When the seasons shifted, prey would move across large distances, and the predators followed. This created broad, repeating loops. Giant sharks weren't wandering blindly. They were tracking reliable paths. Those routes might have taken them across entire oceans. They likely passed over volcanic ridges, through deep central basins near wide shelves, and alongside coastlines that would look unfamiliar to us today. The water itself carried more heat than the modern ocean. This warmth didn't come from sudden spikes or human influence. It came from natural climate cycles that shaped entire ages. When ocean temperatures rise slowly and stay stable long enough, food webs expand. More plankton means more small fish. More small fish means more medium fish. More medium fish means diverse predators. And if the environment remains consistent for long periods, some of those predators grow larger because nothing pushes back against that possibility. Giant sharks were not accidents of evolution. They were shaped by an environment that made their existence practical. If they had lived in the types of oceans we know today, with colder patches and fewer large prey animals, they would not have reached the sizes they did. Their world was a place where scale played out differently. The ocean was wide enough and rich enough that size became a useful trait. The marine mammals of the time were especially important in this story. Many early whales were far bulkier than most modern species. They had thick layers of fat, sturdy bodies and slower movements. Their migrations were predictable. Their young were vulnerable during certain times of year. Entire groups travelled through warm coastal regions to feed or give birth. Those regions became steady feeding grounds for hunters that followed these patterns across generations. A giant shark didn't need to be agile to catch such prey. It only needed to be persistent and powerful. If you drift further into this picture, you might start noticing how different the ocean floor looked. The deep regions were similar to what we know today, but the shallow areas stretched farther. These shelves were busy with life. Early relatives of seals, manatees and whales swam through waters filled with fish and invertebrates. Coral reefs took different forms than the ones you might imagine. Some were larger, others smaller, depending on the era. Forests of kelp and other marine plants covered certain regions. This variety gave large predators many places to find prey, and while the sharks that drifted through these seas were enormous, they weren't the only large animals. Some whales grew to impressive sizes too, although not on the scale of the giants we know today like the blue whale. Other shark species shared the ocean, some large, some small. Reptiles continued to exist in certain periods, though by the time Megalodon appeared, most of the great marine reptiles had long disappeared. Still, the ocean was not empty. It was full of life at every size. The giants drifted through it all with a steadiness that matched the conditions of their time. Their power came from more than their size. It came from the environment that allowed them to grow slowly, live long lives, and reproduce in waters that favoured stability. The young of these sharks were probably already large when born, giving them a better chance of survival in a sea full of competition. Large size protected them from many dangers. It also let them travel efficiently. When you're that big, the open ocean feels less like a barrier and more like a path. Imagine being in those waters without focusing on fear or danger. Instead, think about the scale of everything. The length of the sharks passing beneath you, the width of the space they move through, the height of the waves shaped by steady currents, the distances between feeding grounds, the number of years these predators lived. Every part of their existence depended on slow, steady patterns. That's how the giants drifted. Not in frantic bursts, but in long movements shaped by a world that gave them what they needed. If you follow this thought a little longer, you might consider how the smaller animals behaved around such predators. Modern prey species have evolved to deal with sharks that are quick, agile, and often rely on surprise. In the ancient seas, many prey species faced threats from animals that were enormous, predictable, and powerful. Their survival strategies reflected that. Some travelled in large groups, others moved into shallow regions during certain times of year. Some relied on speed only when needed, conserving energy most of the time. Many simply stayed close to areas rich in food, hoping that abundance alone would lower their chances of being targeted. These behaviours helped define the world where giant sharks lived. Everything that drifted in those waters influenced everything else. That interconnectedness meant the giants were just one part of a much larger, much older pattern. Their presence shaped other species, but not through constant fear or chaos. It happened slowly, as prey moved differently, predators adjusted their range, and the ocean's ecosystem responded to the large animals passing through it. The giants drifted in waters shaped by millions of years of quiet changes. The sea level rose and fell at times, but often slowly enough that life adapted without losing its balance. Currents altered paths across different ages. New species appeared while older ones faded. Through all of it, these predators continued to move, taking advantage of a world that supported their size and habits. They were not temporary accidents. They were long-standing residents of the oceans that belonged to their time. If you stay with this image a bit longer, you might begin to feel how calm much of their world actually was. There were dangers, of course, and moments of predation, but overall the ocean moved with patience. Storms came and went. Seasons shifted. The waters warmed and cooled with the planet's natural rhythms. Through all of it, the giants travelled paths so old that they probably felt familiar to each generation that followed. And as you hold on to that picture, you can feel how this slow, steady drifting shaped entire ecosystems. It gave form to food chains, migration routes, reproductive cycles, and the balance between predator and prey. That balance didn't break overnight. It changed over thousands and millions of years. The world where giant sharks lived stayed stable long enough for them to thrive. We'll continue moving through that world, looking more closely at how these oceans formed, how they changed, and what allowed such massive creatures to rise within them, all without rushing toward an ending or stepping away from the quiet pace of this journey. The oceans that existed during the age of giant sharks did not appear suddenly. They formed across spans of time so long that the entire history of human civilization would fit into a thin layer near the end of it, barely noticeable on the timeline of Earth's changes. To picture those oceans fully, it helps to pause for a moment and settle into the idea that the world we know today is only a brief moment in a much longer story. The surface of the planet has shifted, stretched, broken apart, and reformed more times than our minds can easily process. The seas that nurtured enormous sharks were just one version of Earth's waters, created by geological movements that continued steadily for millions of years without stopping. If you imagine looking down on the planet long before any familiar animals appeared, you would see continents arranged in ways that feel unfamiliar. Land masses that today sit thousands of miles apart were once connected. Some that now drift in isolated corners of the map were once part of large combined regions. Mountain ranges grew and eroded. Volcanic activity reshaped the edges of continents. The seafloor itself changed as new crust formed, and old crust sank back into the Earth's interior. The oceans followed these changes, expanding in some regions, narrowing in others, and continuously creating new environments for life. The waters that giant sharks inhabited came after many of these transformations. They developed during a time when the planet's temperature supported extensive marine ecosystems. Warmth spread across the globe more evenly than it does now. The poles were not always icy caps. The equator did not always hold the greatest heat. Instead, the difference between hot and cold was gentler, allowing marine life to spread widely. This broad distribution of warmth created habitats that encouraged growth, both in population and in physical size. When you picture these oceans, it's important to imagine not just their surface, but the layers beneath it. The topmost layer, touched by sunlight, supported vast communities of small organisms. These microscopic plants formed the foundation of the food chain. Below them, small fish, early relatives of modern species, fed and reproduced in numbers large enough to influence the larger predators above them. Deeper still, the water cooled and darkened, but life remained. The deeper regions held strange forms that adapted to limited light and cooler temperatures. The giant sharks did not spend all their time near the bottom, but they likely passed through these layers depending on the season, the location of prey, and the changing conditions of their environment. Understanding deep time means recognizing that the ocean structure changed gradually. What took place beneath the surface happened slowly enough that each generation of animals barely noticed. Temperature shifts that would alarm modern humans happened over spans far longer than any individual's lifespan. A species could adapt gradually to each small change. When sea levels rose, it was not in sudden surges. Coastlines moved over thousands of years. Entire regions that had once been dry land became shallow seas. Animals moved into these new environments as easily as humans move into newly built homes, only without any awareness of how recent the change really was. These shifts provided opportunities for marine life. As coastlines widened and shallow regions expanded, new feeding grounds formed. Early whales moved into these waters because they offered reliable food. Schools of fish proliferated in areas that had once been barren. Coral structures grew in places where sunlight reached comfortably. Each of these changes created more room for predators to roam. And in a world that continued warming gradually, these new habitats were stable enough to support life on a massive scale. This is where the giant sharks found their place. They weren't forced into narrow territories. They weren't trapped by cold currents or isolated patches of food. Instead, they swam in open oceans filled with prey and shaped by a climate that changed steadily but predictably. Their environment provided consistency, and consistency encouraged growth. A predator that could survive long periods became larger over generations. Those that thrived at larger size passed on their advantages to their offspring, and across enough time the biggest sharks slowly came to dominate the seas. If you look at this through the lens of deep time, their rise makes sense. It wasn't a sudden jump. It wasn't a dramatic evolutionary leap. It was the result of gradual shifts that unfolded patiently. The ocean changed in ways that supported them. The prey species adapted in ways that allowed them to grow in number and size. The overall environment balanced warmth, food, and space. Everything fit together the way gears in a clock might turn, only much slower and without the intention we associate with machines. Moving further into this picture, it helps to consider the world's chemistry at the time. The oceans held different concentrations of minerals and nutrients than they do today. These differences affected everything from the growth of plankton to the development of marine mammals. More nutrients in the water meant more primary producers. More primary producers meant more animals higher up the chain. This increased availability of food is one of the main reasons the oceans of deep time could sustain such large predators. Every movement, from microscopic drifts to long migrations of marine mammals, supported an interconnected web of life that reached up to the giants. The seafloor also played a role in shaping life above it. Undersea mountains, ridges and trenches channeled currents that brought nutrients up from deeper waters. These currents acted like conveyor belts, carrying life-sustaining materials across vast distances. Prey species congregated in areas where these currents brought abundance. Their presence attracted predators. Over thousands of years, these repeated patterns turned certain regions into dependable feeding zones. A giant shark didn't simply wander. It followed these underwater highways, moving along routes that had existed long before it was born. If you picture yourself drifting down into deeper layers, the pressure increases and the light fades. In these darker regions, life adapted to conditions that would feel harsh by human standards. Yet the animals that lived there did not experience it as harsh. It was simply the world they knew. Some species moved freely between the surface and the depths. Others spent most of their time far below, rising occasionally to feed. The giant sharks probably didn't descend into the deepest trenches, but they were capable of exploring lower layers when necessary. Their bodies were built for strength and endurance, not just speed. They could move through these depths when following prey or searching for cooler waters. This connection between different layers of the ocean highlights how important deep time is in understanding their environment. Over millions of years, the structure of these layers changed. Currents shifted direction. Temperature bands rose and fell. Nutrient levels fluctuated. But the changes were slow enough that life adapted continuously. New species emerged as old ones disappeared. These shifts created new opportunities for predators that could grow large and survive long periods. Another important aspect of deep time is the role of Earth's shifting continents. As land masses moved, they created new pathways for water to flow. Large inland seas formed and disappeared. Channels widened or closed. These geological changes influenced the temperature and movement of the ocean. For instance, when a seaway opened, warm water could travel farther north. When a connection closed, certain regions cooled. These kinds of changes shaped the habitats available to large sharks. They might have expanded their range during warm periods and retreated slightly during cooler phases, always adjusting to the slow reshaping of their world. Through all of this, the ocean supported an enormous variety of life. Some animals resembled modern species. Others had no direct descendants at all. Entire groups thrived for millions of years before disappearing, replaced by new forms better suited to the changing world. Looking at these patterns helps explain why giant sharks appeared when they did, and why they eventually vanished. Their time in the ocean was part of a longer cycle, not an isolated episode. Even the giants themselves were shaped by deep time. Their ancestors were smaller and lived in earlier periods when different creatures dominated the seas. Over generations, those early sharks adapted to a world filled with increasingly large prey. Their bodies grew, their jaws strengthened, their teeth became more specialized. And as the oceans continued changing gradually, these adaptations became more pronounced. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't forced, It happened across thousands of generations, each one slightly different from the last. If you imagine floating through one of these ancient oceans, you might notice how normal everything feels within its own context. The giant sharks weren't out of place. They fit into their world just as modern animals fit into ours. The fish around them looked different, but the interactions were familiar. Some species fed near the surface, others moved along the sea floor. Marine mammals travelled through open water. The predators followed. Life repeated itself in cycles that stretched across millions of years, each cycle shaped by the slow turning of Earth's geological processes. Staying with this image helps emphasize the scale of time involved. The surface of the ocean might seem calm on any given day, but beneath that calm surface lay a timeline that stretched backward far beyond anything we experience. Each grain of sediment, each change in water temperature, each shift in the continents played a role in shaping this world. Understanding that scale helps us appreciate the giants not as strange anomalies, but as natural results of long-term stability. The sharks that drifted through these waters were shaped by conditions that built themselves slowly. Their lives unfolded within a world that changed at a pace too gradual for them to recognize. And as we continue exploring that world, we'll look more closely at how these warm oceans formed, how life responded to them, and how the giants rose from those conditions without rushing through any part of the story. The oceans that eventually supported the largest sharks in history began forming long before those predators existed. To understand the world they lived in, it helps to step back into a time when Earth had not yet settled into the form we recognize. Continents were still shifting into their positions. Climates shifted slowly. Entire environments formed and disappeared over spans far longer than any familiar timeline. The world was always moving, but at a speed too slow for any creature of that era to notice. That slow movement built the stage where the oceans of the giant sharks would later spread. If you start at a moment when the Earth's early continents still sat close together, you'll find a world dominated by vast single land masses. Over millions of years, those masses broke apart. The fractures created new coastlines. As the plates drifted, water rushed into the spaces between them. These widening gaps eventually became the oceans that life would depend on. Sea levels rose at some times and fell at others. Mountains pushed upward. Valleys sank into the crust. Volcanic eruptions shaped the edges of continents. Every part of the planet contributed to building the seas the giant sharks would later roam. None of these changes happened quickly. They stretched across spans so long that life adapted without any awareness that adaptation was taking place. Shifts in temperature took thousands to millions of years. Changes in coastlines took similar amounts of time. Rivers carved channels, rain-shaped plains. The air itself carried different gases at times. Conditions did not swing sharply from one extreme to another. They drifted, and life drifted with them. During certain periods of Earth's history, the ocean settled into warmer phases. These warm phases supported an enormous range of animals. The warmth reached far, not limited to the narrow equatorial belts familiar today. Unlike the chilly waters of modern polar regions, earlier seas extended warmth into areas now associated with icy climates. This warmth encouraged large populations of fish and marine mammals. Life spread across most temperate zones without the steep temperature barriers that restrict species today. That broad distribution allowed predators to expand their range and help the giants rise later on. The planet's climate during these early phases was influenced by many factors. Volcanic activity released gases that affected the composition of the atmosphere. The layout of land masses influenced how winds moved across the surface of the ocean. Currents developed pathways shaped by underwater mountains and ridges. Glaciers grew and shrank depending on the era, but overall long stretches of time favoured warmer oceans. It was during these stretches that life flourished in ways we no longer see. If you picture standing at the edge of one of those early oceans, you wouldn't recognise the horizon. The coastlines would not resemble any familiar map. In some areas, what looks like a coastline in your imagination might actually have been an inland sea. In others, land that seems solid today would have been underwater. The shifting of the continents didn't happen in predictable patterns. Some plates moved faster than others, some collided and pushed up mountain ranges, others drifted apart and created deep basins. Water filled those basins and new ecosystems developed. Beneath the surface, things were changing just as steadily. Underwater volcanoes erupted quietly across long ridges. These eruptions created new seafloor, pushing older layers outward. As older seafloor moved, it eventually returned to the Earth's interior through subduction zones. This constant recycling kept the ocean floor fresh and active. The process shaped currents, nutrient availability, and the distribution of marine life. Changes in the deep ocean affected the surface, even if the animals at the surface never sensed those deeper movements. The early oceans supported simpler animals at first. Tiny drifting organisms, small fish, and early invertebrates filled the waters. As time passed, these life forms diversified. Some grew larger, others developed new ways of feeding or moving. Predators became more specialized. Prey developed defenses. Over millions of years, the food web became more complex. Entire groups of animals emerged and disappeared. Each group brought its own impact to the ecosystem. Some introduced new competition. Others opened spaces for predators to grow larger. As continents drifted apart, they created new marine corridors. Water flowed into areas that had been blocked before. The movement of warm and cold water changed. These changes affected migrations. Species that once stayed near one region could now travel farther. These expanded routes allowed predators to follow prey into new waters. Over time, large regions of the ocean became accessible to animals that required abundant food. That abundance is what allowed later sharks to reach extreme sizes. One of the most important developments in these early oceans was the rise of marine mammals. Before these mammals dominated the seas, reptiles held many of the top predator roles. Eventually the reptiles declined. Their disappearance created gaps in the food chain. Into those gaps came the early ancestors of whales and dolphins. These mammals adapted to life in the water and spread into many regions. Some species grew thick layers of fat to regulate their temperature. Others developed long, powerful bodies for endurance. They travelled in groups and followed predictable feeding routes. These marine mammals became some of the most important prey for the giants that came later. Their size and abundance provided a dependable food supply. Before whales appeared in large numbers, the ocean simply could not support predators as large as the ones that eventually evolved. Once marine mammals spread across the oceans, the balance changed. Predators capable of hunting them gained significant advantages. Over time, these predators evolved into larger and more powerful species. Understanding this shift helps explain why the world before our own took shape in a way that allowed giant sharks to thrive. Every part of the planet contributed to that outcome. Heat spread across wide areas. Nutrients circulated through currents driven by geological forces. Marine mammals expanded into new regions. Fish populations grew in warmer waters. And over time, the balance between predator and prey shifted in favour of those capable of handling large prey. If you picture the ocean during this period, you'd see life arranged in layers. The upper layers would be bright and full of movement. Schools of fish swam in patterns shaped by the water's surface. Marine mammals travelled in groups, surfacing occasionally for air. Sharks of varying sizes followed them at a distance. None of the animals lived in isolation. Their lives depended on the movements of others. Even the giants were not separate from the system. They followed the patterns created by smaller creatures. Their own behaviour was shaped by the environment they lived in. Following these layers downward, the water darkened but still supported life. Deep-sea environments developed forms that adapted to limited light. Some species drifted slowly, others hid in crevices. Many waited for food to drift down from the upper layers. The deep waters played a role in recycling nutrients back toward the surface. Strong upwelling currents carried these nutrients upward. This cycle supported the plankton populations that fueled the entire food chain. The more stable the climate remained, the more predictable the system became. Predictability is one of the most important factors in supporting large predators. When food sources remain abundant over long periods, predators can grow bigger without risking starvation. This consistency is what helped the earliest large sharks evolve. They were not forced to adapt suddenly. They adapted slowly to a world that changed gradually. As prey grew larger, predators grew to match them. During these early phases, Earth didn't look barren or empty. It was full of life, but not the kind we recognize today. Forests covered areas that are deserts now. Swamps filled regions that are currently cold. Rivers ran through valleys that have long since disappeared. The animals on land evolved separately from those in the sea, yet both were influenced by the same climate patterns. When rain patterns changed, river systems shifted. When sea levels changed, coastlines moved. Every part of the world was connected, even if the connections weren't obvious. The rise of complex ecosystems in the water was tied to the stability of the environment. During warm phases, coral reefs expanded. They created habitats for thousands of species. These reefs acted as nurseries for young fish. They protected small animals from predators. They filtered the water and contributed to the balance of nutrients. When reefs grew large, they supported entire communities of marine life. Those communities helped support larger predators. Deeper in the ocean, large underwater mountains created barriers that shaped currents. These mountains redirected water in ways that influenced migration patterns. Some regions were constantly fed by nutrient-rich water rising from the deep. Others remained calmer and supported more stable populations. The differences between these regions created opportunities for different types of animals to thrive. The giants moved between these regions following prey that relied on the currents. As the world continued shifting, certain coastlines became more favourable for large populations of marine mammals. When those populations increased, the predators followed. Over time, this pattern encouraged the development of sharks capable of hunting large prey. Their bodies became more robust. Their jaws strengthened. Their teeth grew larger and more specialised. These changes took place over millions of years, shaped by the slow unfolding of Earth's geological processes. If you imagine floating through one of these early seas, you wouldn't see the world as chaotic or extreme. You would see a stable environment shaped by steady rhythms. The water temperature remained warm across wide regions. Prey species moved in patterns that repeated over generations. Predators followed those patterns. The slow pace of change allowed everything to find a place in the system, and within this stable network the giants gradually rose to dominance. This world existed long before any human saw the ocean. Its coastlines changed gradually. Its temperatures shifted without sudden spikes. Its animals adapted without the interruptions seen today. The Earth shaped itself slowly, layer by layer, ridge by ridge, current by current. As we continue moving through this story, the environment will keep expanding, revealing how each piece contributed to the rise of the giants that later ruled these ancient waters. When the oceans shifted into warmer ages, life responded in ways that can only happen when conditions remain steady for long stretches of time. These warm phases didn't arrive with sudden changes. They developed over millions of years, shaped by the planet's slow cycles and the gradual rearrangement of continents. As warmth spread across wider regions, the water became a place where growth accelerated, where abundance was easier to maintain, and where species that had once been limited by cooler temperatures suddenly found space to expand. The oceans became places where life didn't just survive, it multiplied, diversified, and pushed into forms far larger than the ones familiar today. To picture this period, imagine a world without ice caps. The poles were not frozen landscapes. They held forests, warm water, and coastlines that looked nothing like the ones we know. Instead of abrupt temperature differences between regions, the planet maintained a gentler gradient. Warm water moved freely through channels that are now blocked or narrowed. The air held more moisture. Storm patterns followed broader paths. This meant the oceans didn't divide into sharply separate zones. Species could travel farther without encountering dramatic shifts in temperature. This steady warmth allowed life to grow bolder. Animals that once stayed within certain regions began venturing across wider areas. Plants and algae thrived in conditions that supported rapid reproduction. Prey animals that depended on these plants multiplied. With more prey came more predators. The entire food web grew more complex, and the increase in activity supported species capable of reaching enormous sizes. These warm oceans didn't push animals towards size through sudden events, they encouraged it through stability. One of the clearest signs of this change came from the early whales. As marine mammals evolved and adapted to life in the water, many of them expanded their range in response to the warmth. They could feed in areas that would be inhospitable today. Their young developed in calm, stable waters. Their migrations grew longer. In time, many of them became large, slow-moving animals with enough mass to deter smaller predators, but not enough speed to evade larger ones. This combination of size and predictability made them ideal prey for the giants that would later dominate the oceans. But the rise of these mammals was not the only factor contributing to the boldness of ocean life. Fish species expanded into new roles. Some developed stronger bodies that allowed them to travel long distances. Others grew larger to take advantage of abundant food. Many species formed huge schools that moved in coordinated patterns. These schools filled the water with movement, providing constant opportunity for predators. And in the background, plankton, tiny organisms that seem insignificant individually, played one of the most important roles. Their populations surged because warm water supported rapid growth. More plankton meant more food for small fish. More small fish meant more food for predators. This entire system fed into itself. The more life there was, the more life the ocean could support. Warmth didn't just encourage growth, it allowed the ecosystem to step into a higher gear. During this time, predators evolved in response to the opportunities around them. Sharks developed stronger muscles and more efficient bodies. Their senses sharpened. Their hunting strategies changed. Some species invested in speed. Others developed endurance. Even those that remained small benefited from the abundance of prey. But the larger sharks, those that eventually reached staggering lengths, took advantage of both the stability of the climate and the behavior of the growing marine mammal population. The waters these animals roamed weren't just teeming with life. They were structured in a way that encouraged movement. Currents carried warm water across large distances. These currents also carried prey. Marine mammals followed these routes, sometimes travelling hundreds or thousands of miles each year. Predators learned to follow these paths, returning to the same regions generation after generation. Over millions of years, this pattern created reliable feeding zones, where large predators could thrive without exhausting the supply of prey. The warmer the water became, the more these migration patterns solidified. In some parts of the world, shallow seas formed where once there had been land. These shallow regions filled with life. Early whales used them as calving grounds. Fish fed in these protected waters. Sharks, including the early ancestors of the giants, patrolled the edges. These regions served as hubs of activity, with predators waiting for opportunities that came as predictably as the seasons. Because warmth encourages faster metabolism in many marine species, the cycles of life moved at a comfortable pace. Prey matured more quickly. Populations grew faster. This created an environment where predators rarely faced scarcity. In such an environment, size became an advantage rather than a liability. A large predator with strong endurance could dominate large territories without exhausting its energy supply. And when prey species themselves grew larger, a trend supported by stability and abundance, the predators adapted by growing larger too. This was not a world filled with constant danger or dramatic chases. It was a world where everything followed patterns. When prey moved south, predators followed. When prey gathered in shallow water, predators waited along the deeper edges. When the season shifted gradually, the entire ecosystem shifted with them. The giants that later ruled these oceans were shaped by these steady movements. If you imagine drifting alongside one of these early whales, you would notice how calm the water feels. These mammals would surface for air, travel in groups, communicate with low sounds, and glide through warm currents. They did not rush unless necessary. Their movements were guided by the availability of food and the comfort of the water. Their predictability allowed predators to find them easily. A giant shark didn't need to ambush every meal. Sometimes it only needed to appear in the right place. Life grew bolder in these oceans because conditions rewarded boldness. Species that ventured into new waters often found food rather than danger. Those that grew larger found fewer predators capable of threatening them. Those that travelled long distances discovered opportunities to feed and reproduce in regions that remained stable for millions of years. These patterns built confidence across the food web. Species pushed into new roles. Their behaviour became more dynamic. Their size increased where it benefited survival. In this environment, even the seafloor contributed to shaping life. Shallow regions offered resting and feeding grounds. Deep trenches offered cooler waters for animals that needed them. Underwater mountains created shadows in the current where plankton collected. Coral reefs, when present, supported young fish and protected small creatures. The entire structure of the ocean worked together to support abundance. As we move through this world, it becomes clear that warmth didn't just make the oceans pleasant, it made them productive. Higher temperatures supported faster chemical processes. Nutrients cycled more quickly. Plant-like organisms photosynthesized at high rates. Everything grew efficiently, and because the growth remained stable across long spans of time, species had the opportunity to explore new behaviors and new sizes without being cut off by sudden shifts. This stability brought out a kind of confidence in marine life. Animals didn't need to remain small to survive. They didn't need to hide as frequently. They didn't need to conserve energy in the same way species do in cooler waters. Many of them could afford to grow bigger, move farther, and interact more frequently with other species. This is the setting that encouraged the ancestors of giant sharks to adapt in extraordinary ways. Over time, as these warm oceans supported more and more life, the balance between predator and prey grew more intricate. Some predators developed new ways to use the environment to their advantage. They followed currents to conserve energy. They used their sense of temperature to track prey. They identified regions where prey gathered during different times of year. These patterns made the ocean feel organized, even though it was constantly changing beneath the surface. The warmth also influenced reproduction. Many species could reproduce more frequently in such stable conditions. Their offspring grew at faster rates. This meant prey populations stayed strong, which in turn supported predators capable of surviving long periods between meals. Large predators benefit from prolonged stability even more than small ones, because their survival depends on consistent access to food. The warm oceans provided this for millions of years. As these patterns continued, the environment laid the foundation for creatures so large that they would leave a lasting mark on the fossil record long after they disappeared. The giants that eventually ruled these waters did not arise suddenly or without reason. They emerged from generations of smaller ancestors that lived in a world where boldness, size, and endurance were rewarded by conditions that remained favourable for extended periods. If you stay with this image and picture the ocean continuing to warm over long spans of time, you can see how each generation of marine life adjusted gradually. Nothing about the process felt abrupt from the perspective of the animals living in it. Each generation lived within an environment that felt familiar, stable, and predictable. Yet across millions of years, the outcome was transformation. Entire groups of animals grew larger than any version of them that came before. Predators learned to travel across the world. Prey developed new strategies. The system adapted, but never in a way that disrupted the balance. This warm phase provided the conditions that would later allow giant sharks to dominate their ecosystems. And as we continue, the ocean will keep opening up. revealing how these steady changes shaped the movement, structure, and behaviour of the creatures that lived within it. The world that nurtured the emergence of enormous sharks was already filled with the conditions that favoured growth, stability, and long-term survival. But the rise of predators large enough to dominate entire stretches of ocean was not just a response to warm waters or plentiful prey. It came from a combination of environmental support, evolutionary opportunity, and the steady shaping of bodies and behaviours across countless generations. When life grows under conditions that remain predictable for long periods, some species begin to push the limits of what their environments allow. In the oceans of deep time, this slow push eventually created hunters far larger than anything living today. If you picture an early shark species from millions of years before the giants appeared, it would not seem impressive at first glance. Many of them were relatively small by our standards. Some resembled modern sharks, but with subtle differences in body structure. Others looked like transitional versions of species that would later fill the seas. They hunted fish, small marine reptiles, and invertebrates. Their lives were shaped by the availability of prey, the temperature of the water, and the structure of the ocean currents. They weren't weak or unimpressive. They simply lived in worlds where size was not yet the benefit it would soon become. As marine mammals grew larger and more numerous, they introduced a new opportunity to the ecosystem. These mammals were substantial, slow to accelerate, and often travelled in predictable groups. Their bodies contained large amounts of fat, which made them especially valuable to predators. For a shark, the difference between hunting small fish and hunting a marine mammal was the difference between snacking and feasting. A single whale or early dolphin could sustain a large predator for a long time. This new prey source changed everything. The ecosystem adjusted, and sharks that could exploit this opportunity gained an advantage. The first of these predators were not enormous. They were simply well adapted for taking down mammals. Over generations, traits that favoured strength, endurance, and powerful jaws became more pronounced. Sharks grew larger because each additional increase in size brought benefits. A bigger shark could overpower bigger prey. It could travel longer distances without exhausting itself. It could produce larger offspring that had a better chance of surviving early life. And in waters with plenty of prey, the energy cost of maintaining such a large body was manageable. This gradual increase in size didn't appear suddenly. It happened slowly as small advantages accumulated. A slightly bigger individual survived, where a smaller one did not. A shark with more powerful muscles could follow migrating prey more effectively. One with slightly larger teeth could tackle mammals that earlier generations struggled with. These advantages repeated across thousands of generations, and as long as the ecosystem continued supporting abundance, size continued to increase. Eventually, some shark lineages reached a scale that separated them from their predecessors. Their bodies became thicker, their jaws expanded, their tooth structure shifted toward large triangular shapes capable of slicing through bone and flesh. Their skeletons, made of cartilage rather than bone, allowed them to grow without the limitations faced by many other vertebrates. Cartilage is strong but lightweight. These predators could reach lengths that would be impossible for most bony fish. Their bodies became built for sweeping, long-distance movement across warm waters. As these sharks grew, their presence began to influence the entire ecosystem. Prey species developed new strategies for avoiding them. Some groups travelled in tighter formations to confuse predators. Others moved into shallower regions during certain seasons. Some species developed slightly faster swimming speeds, though not enough to outrun large predators. Many marine mammals gave birth in protected areas where newborns had a chance to grow before entering open waters. All of these changes happened gradually, but each adjustment played a role in the arms race between predator and prey. The rise of colossal hunters also influenced the behaviour of smaller predators. Medium-sized sharks and other carnivores adapted their feeding strategies to avoid competition with the giants. Some hunted at different depths, others targeted prey in regions less frequented by the large sharks. This separation helped maintain stability in the ocean. When predators divide resources rather than compete for them directly, ecosystems remain balanced. In these warm oceans, the balance lasted long enough to support predators of extraordinary size. If you imagine watching one of these early large sharks moving through the water, you would notice that it was built more for long, steady travel than quick bursts of speed. The biggest predators rarely needed to sprint. Their prey moved predictably. A slow, steady approach was often enough. Their bodies moved with the water rather than against it. They could track the scent or sound of prey across long distances. Their fins were shaped for efficient gliding. Their muscles were dense, but arranged in a way that allowed sustained motion. Everything about them was built for endurance and power. The giants also benefited from the temperature of the water. Warm seas helped regulate their internal energy. Unlike mammals, sharks do not maintain a constant internal temperature. They depend on the ocean around them. In a consistently warm environment, their bodies could function efficiently without needing to expend extra energy. This meant they could grow larger without struggling to maintain their metabolic needs. The stability of these temperatures contributed to their size just as much as the abundance of prey. Another factor in the rise of these predators was the lack of competition for their specific niche. No other species at the time was large enough or adapted enough to challenge them. Some marine mammals were strong and heavy, but they lacked the agility and jaw strength needed to compete with the sharks. Other shark species occupied different roles and did not grow large enough or powerful enough to contest the giants. This left the top of the food chain open for a predator that could exploit the wealth of resources in the warm oceans. As these sharks evolved, their teeth changed dramatically. Earlier sharks had smaller, simpler teeth suited for catching fish or small marine animals. But as they began preying on large mammals, their teeth shifted into large, serrated triangles, capable of cutting through thick flesh and bone. These teeth were replaced continuously throughout a shark's life, ensuring that even if a tooth broke or wore down, another was ready to take its place. The scale of these teeth in the larger sharks became enormous, large enough to reveal their presence in the fossil record long after the species themselves disappeared. Their jaws were equally impressive. The muscles attached to their upper and lower jaws grew stronger. The structure of their skulls became more suited to delivering powerful bites. The cartilage framework allowed flexibility while maintaining strength. This meant that the giants could open their mouths wide enough to engulf large portions of their prey. Their bite force increased across generations as their prey grew larger and more robust. These sharks also likely developed more complex hunting strategies as they grew. While many modern sharks rely on instinctual behavior, large predators in stable environments often develop patterns that align with the behavior of their prey. The giants may have learned to anticipate where early whales would travel during certain times of year. They may have used deep waters to approach prey from below. They may have targeted individuals that were slower, older, injured, or young. While we cannot observe their behavior directly, the characteristics of their bodies and the structure of their environment give us enough information to understand that their hunting strategies would have matched their enormous size. The rise of these predators also contributed to maintaining the health of the ocean ecosystem. Large predators play a crucial role in controlling prey populations. They help prevent overpopulation of certain species. They influence the movement of prey, which affects the distribution of nutrients. By removing weak or sick individuals, predators help maintain the genetic strength of prey species. In the ancient oceans, the colossal sharks filled this role for millions of years. Their presence helped shape the behavior and evolution of marine mammals and large fish. As their size increased, the distances they traveled also grew. They moved across entire ocean basins following currents and prey migrations. Their presence was not limited to a single region. They likely traveled from coast to coast, from shallow regions to deeper waters, from one hemisphere to another, depending on the temperature and food availability. This movement helped spread their influence across large portions of the planet. Wherever prey existed in abundance, the giants could appear. Their young were also substantial compared to other shark species. Fossil evidence suggests that they gave birth to offspring large enough to immediately function in the open ocean. This strategy helped protect the young from smaller predators. A newborn large shark had a greater chance of surviving early life than a smaller species would under the same conditions. This reproductive advantage allowed the giants to maintain their populations across long spans of time. If you imagine drifting through the ocean during their rise, you would sense how the presence of these sharks affected everything around them. When a large predator swims through the water, smaller animals move aside. Schools of fish shift direction. Marine mammals alter their path. Even without direct interaction, the giants shape the behavior of the creatures around them. Their size alone created changes in movement and distribution across the ecosystem. The rise of these colossal hunters was not a brief moment. It was a slow, steady ascent shaped by environmental stability, abundant prey, and the gradual refinement of physical traits. They did not appear fully formed. They grew from ancestors that adapted to the opportunities around them, and as long as the oceans remained warm, rich, and predictable, these predators continued expanding into the role that the environment opened for them. The oceans that carried the enormous sharks of the past were not still bodies of water. They moved constantly, shaped by forces that acted across scales so large that no single creature could ever recognize them. The movement of these prehistoric seas was the quiet engine driving everything that lived within them. It fed plankton, carried nutrients, guided migrations, and influenced where predators could hunt successfully. Understanding how these oceans circulated helps explain why life thrived so extensively during the periods when giant sharks dominated the water. If you imagine looking down at the ancient Earth from far above, you would see currents stretching across entire ocean basins. These currents did not form by accident. They developed gradually as continents drifted into new shapes and as the heat from the sun spread unevenly across the planet. Warm water rose in some areas and sank in others. Wind pushed the surface water in consistent directions. Tectonic activity created underwater ridges and deep trenches that redirected the flow. Over millions of years, these forces created stable circulation patterns that help support the complex ecosystems of the prehistoric seas. Warm surface currents were especially important. During periods when the oceans were warmer overall, these currents reached farther. They carried heat into regions that are now cold and barren. They transported plankton-rich water into zones that became dependable feeding grounds. Marine mammals followed these currents because they led to areas with predictable food supplies. And where marine mammals travelled, the colossal sharks followed. The water did not move uniformly. Some currents were strong and fast, while others moved slowly along the edges of continents. In deep time, many of these currents acted like conveyor belts, carrying nutrients from one region to another. When water sank to the ocean floor, it carried oxygen downward. When deep water rose again through upwelling, it brought nutrients back toward the surface. These nutrients supported the smallest organisms, the plankton that formed the base of the entire food chain. Without this constant movement, the oceans could never have supported the abundance needed for large predators. Upwelling played a particularly important role in shaping life. It occurred in regions where wind pushed surface water aside, allowing deeper water to rise. This deeper water was often rich in nutrients accumulated from decaying organisms that had drifted downward. When it reached the surface, the nutrients supported massive blooms of plankton. Those blooms fed small fish. The small fish fed larger ones. Marine mammals fed on both, depending on their species and feeding strategies. Entire ecosystems formed around these rising streams of nutrient-rich water. Prehistoric seas also breathed through temperature gradients. Warm water holds less oxygen than cold water, which influenced where certain species could survive. In the ancient warm oceans, some regions held limited oxygen at depth. Animals that lived in these regions adapted to the conditions. Higher oxygen levels near the surface supported species that needed more of it, while the deeper zones supported species that evolved ways to function with less. This vertical separation helped maintain balance in the ecosystem. Predators moved between these layers depending on temperature, prey availability, and their own biological needs. The movement of tides contributed to this rhythm as well. Although tides were influenced by the same gravitational forces that affect them today, prehistoric coastlines shaped them differently. Shallow seas rising over wide continental shelves created stronger tidal ranges in some areas. These tides stirred the water, mixing nutrients into the upper layers. They also exposed feeding grounds for certain species during low tide. As the water returned, it carried nutrients and drifting organisms back into the sea. Predators learned these patterns, using the tides to their advantage when searching for prey. Wind patterns also influenced the movement of the seas. In warm periods, the difference between warm and cool air masses was not as extreme as it is today, but wind still shaped the surface water. It pushed currents along coastlines, created gyres, and helped carry plankton-rich water across wide distances. These large gyres acted like rotating systems that trapped nutrients and organisms within them. Animals living inside these gyres found food consistently, which made these regions attractive to predators. The underwater terrain contributed just as much to the movement of water. Mountain ranges on the seafloor created pathways and barriers that affected how currents flowed. When water encountered these structures, it was forced upward or sideways, carrying nutrients along with it. Trenches and basins collected cold, dense water that could sit undisturbed for long periods until another force pushed it upward. These movements shaped the distribution of life across different depths. Some animals stayed near the seafloor to take advantage of the stable environment. Others stayed near ridges where nutrients rose. Still others remained near the surface, where sunlight supported the highest productivity. When thinking about how these prehistoric seas fed life, it helps to consider the smallest organisms first. Plankton formed the foundation of the food chain. These tiny organisms multiplied rapidly in warm, nutrient-rich waters. They had no control over where they drifted. They floated with the currents, forming patches that could stretch for miles. Fish followed these patches. Marine mammals followed the fish. Sharks followed the mammals. Every predator depended indirectly on the movement of water that kept plankton populations strong. Because plankton supported so much of the ocean's life, anything that influenced their distribution had an impact across the food chain. When currents shifted direction over thousands of years, plankton distribution shifted. When upwelling increased in certain regions, those areas became hotspots for life. When shallow seas formed, sunlight reached deeper into the water, supporting larger plankton populations. Animals adapted gradually to these changes, but the basic structure of the food web remained intact as long as the ocean continued to circulate. Another important factor was the clarity of the water in many prehistoric oceans. In warm periods when rivers carried fewer sediments into the sea, some regions remained clear for long stretches of time. Sunlight reached deeper, supporting more photosynthesis. Even animals that did not rely on vision benefited from the increased plant growth. Clear water also influenced temperature layering, allowing warm layers to remain stable during certain seasons. The feeding strategies of marine mammals during this time also shaped how the seas functioned. Some species grazed on small organisms near the surface. Others were filter feeders that consumed massive quantities of small fish or krill-like organisms. Still others hunted larger prey. The presence of these mammals in large numbers meant that predators needed to adapt to multiple feeding strategies. A giant shark could not simply chase down small fish all day. It needed prey large enough to sustain its size, and marine mammals provided that opportunity. But these sharks were also part of a larger system. They influenced the distribution of prey. When predators entered certain regions, prey animals moved into different layers of the water column. Some species hid in deeper water until the predator passed. Others moved into shallower water. These shifts created patterns of movement that repeated annually. The seas fed through these patterns just as much as through the currents themselves. Everything depended on the constant circulation of nutrients and the interaction between species. The oxygen content of the water also played a role in shaping the behaviour of large predators. Some regions had oxygen-rich water that supported high-energy activities. Others had low oxygen zones where slower, more patient animals thrived. The giants could move between these zones depending on what they needed. They may have hunted in oxygen-rich areas where prey moved faster. They may have retreated to deeper, cooler waters during certain times of year. Their ability to navigate such large ranges made them successful across many regions. These ancient seas also contained layers of water at different temperatures. Warm surface waters often sat atop cooler, denser layers. These layers did not mix easily unless storms or currents stirred them. Animals that preferred warmth stayed near the surface. Those that needed cooler water moved downward. This layering helped maintain diversity in the oceans by providing habitats for different species. It also influenced predator behaviour. Large sharks could patrol the boundary between warm and cool layers, taking advantage of prey that lingered near these temperature changes. Storms played a role too. Although the climate was generally warm, storms still formed and moved across the oceans. They stirred the water, mixing nutrients and redistributing plankton. Some storms altered migration paths for marine mammals, leading them into regions they did not normally visit. Predators learned to follow these changes. The giants may have approached storm-affected regions knowing that prey would be concentrated there afterward. Prehistoric seas also produced vast quantities of organic matter through the constant growth and decay of marine life. When organisms died, their bodies drifted downward. Some of this material decomposed near the surface. Some sank to the sea floor. As it decayed, it released nutrients that enriched the water. Currents carried these nutrients upward again. This recycling process meant that the ocean remained productive for long stretches. Even when certain species declined, others filled their place. The system remained balanced because the movement of water kept nutrients in circulation. As these processes continued, the seas developed regions where life concentrated. Coastal areas with shallow water produced abundant plant life. Upwelling zones created feeding grounds for fish. Gyres trapped nutrients and supported diverse communities. Deep-sea trenches supported species adapted to darkness and pressure. Every part of the ocean contributed to the movement, breathing, and feeding of the ecosystem. The giants moved through all of it, guided by instinct and the steady rhythms of the sea. If you picture one of these giant sharks travelling through prehistoric waters, you can imagine it moving across layers of water with different temperatures and oxygen levels. You can imagine it following a scent trail that stretches for miles. You can imagine it patrolling the edges of an upwelling zone where prey gather. You can imagine it gliding through deep water, conserving energy until it senses something worth pursuing. Its movement was shaped entirely by the structure of the water around it. These predators did not control the ocean. They responded to it. Their rise depended on the movement of water that carried prey into their path. Their survival depended on the breathing of the seas that distributed oxygen. Their growth depended on the feeding of the oceans through nutrient cycling. Every aspect of their existence was tied to the movement, structure, and chemistry of the prehistoric seas. The more you look at this world, the more it becomes clear that the ocean was not just a backdrop for the rise of giant sharks. It was an active, dynamic system that influenced every part of their life. And as we move forward, the story of these ancient waters continues to open up, revealing how the interactions between species and the landscape shaped the creatures that lived within them. The oceans that supported the enormous sharks of the past were built on food chains far more layered than the ones people usually imagine when thinking about ancient predators. It's easy to focus on the largest creatures because their size naturally captures attention. But the true strength of the prehistoric seas came from the stability and abundance found at the lower levels. These levels fed everything above them. Without the smallest organisms constantly multiplying and drifting with the currents, the giants that followed would not have had enough energy to survive. To understand how those enormous predators thrived, it helps to drift slowly through each layer of the ancient food chain, noticing how each level supported the next. At the base of everything were the microscopic organisms that filled the water in numbers so large they can only be understood in terms of broad patterns rather than individual counts. These organisms, including plankton and tiny plant-like species, were the quiet engine of the ocean. They captured energy from sunlight, multiplied quickly, and formed dense clouds that drifted along currents. Even though each one was invisible to the animals around them, together they created the foundation that supported the entire ecosystem. Warm prehistoric seas gave them a stable environment with plenty of light and nutrients, allowing them to flourish at a rate that modern ecosystems rarely match. These plankton were eaten by slightly larger organisms, small drifting animals, filter-feeding invertebrates, and young fish that relied on a continual supply of food to grow. Because the oceans moved steadily, these small creatures didn't need to search far to find nourishment. They simply followed the shifting patches of plankton, feeding as they moved. Their own growth created more opportunities for predators. Small fish populations increased and diversified, forming a middle tier in the food chain that supported many other species. These early layers were more than just a collection of small animals. They created structure in the ecosystem. When plankton populations grew, the populations of the small animals that fed on them grew as well. When these lower levels remained strong, everything above them became stronger too. This stability allowed the prehistoric seas to sustain large, complex food webs that could support predators far bigger than anything living today. Without this wide foundation of tiny organisms, the rising complexity in the ocean would not have been possible. Moving one step higher in the food chain, the oceans were filled with medium-sized fish and invertebrates. Many of these species formed schools that moved together, creating large, moving masses of life that attracted predators. Some of these fish had bodies shaped for speed, allowing them to dart through the water in coordinated patterns. Others were slower but plentiful. Their numbers mattered more than individual speed. Conditions in the warm seas encouraged rapid reproduction, so even species that faced heavy predation were able to maintain large populations. These fish played a crucial role because they linked the smallest organisms with the larger predators. Without them, the energy stored in plankton could not have moved up the food chain efficiently. They were the carriers of that energy, transferring it through their own bodies into the predators that fed on them. And because their populations were both diverse and abundant, they sustained a wide range of species: early sharks, marine reptiles in certain periods, large fish-eating mammals, and many others. Some species of fish began to grow larger during this time. This increase in size wasn't random. When conditions remain stable for long stretches, species often grow larger because they face fewer pressures that keep body size small. Larger fish could travel farther, escape smaller predators, and access prey that smaller fish couldn't. Their growth contributed to the next level of the food chain by creating prey that demanded stronger, more capable hunters. As the middle tiers expanded, they supported an increase in predators of varying sizes. Early sharks that lived before the giants appeared often fed on these medium-sized fish. They developed sharper teeth and stronger muscles to hunt efficiently. Their bodies became more streamlined, their senses sharpened so they could detect movement from farther away. These adaptations grew more pronounced over generations, shaping sharks into some of the most efficient predators in the ocean. Alongside sharks, some marine mammals fed on the abundant fish populations. These mammals were not yet the massive whales seen in later periods, but they were strong swimmers that could move quickly through schools of fish. Their presence added another layer of interaction. The more species that fed on the middle tiers, the more pressure the ecosystem placed on maintaining strong plankton populations. Everything was connected, even at these small levels. As the food chain expanded upward, the early forms of marine mammals continued to evolve. Some of them became specialized feeders, Others developed diverse diets that included fish, squid, and other drifting animals. Their variety allowed them to fill many roles in the ecosystem. They were not yet the primary prey of the giant sharks, but they contributed to shaping the environment that allowed larger predators to develop. Eventually, bigger marine mammals appeared. Some species developed long, sleek bodies for endurance swimming. Others evolved large heads and mouths for filter feeding, although true large filter feeders came later in Earth's history. Many early whales had strong bones and thick blubber, which made them valuable targets for predators big enough to take on such large prey. Their growing size shifted the balance in the ocean. Predators capable of hunting these mammals gained significant advantages because each meal provided much more energy than fish could. When early whales rose into the food chain, they changed not just the diet of predators but also the patterns of the entire ecosystem. Their migrations attracted predators along consistent routes. Their calves provided an especially important food source for large hunters. The presence of these mammals in large numbers allowed some predators to evolve strategies that relied on long-distance tracking, rather than constant searching for small prey. The arrival of abundant large prey laid the groundwork for the rise of the colossal sharks. But before exploring their role, it helps to look at how the food chain moved energy upward. In these warm prehistoric oceans, energy flowed consistently from one level to the next. Plankton multiplied rapidly, feeding small animals. Small animals supported medium fish. Medium fish fed both early predators and marine mammals. Marine mammals fed large predators. The system needed each layer to remain stable. If even one level weakened, the chain could falter. But during the warm periods when giant sharks thrived, the chain remained strong. Predators that hunted in these waters did not only feed on marine mammals, they took advantage of every opportunity. Some sharks preyed on large fish when available. Others focused on the weakened or young individuals within marine mammal groups. By combining multiple feeding strategies, they reduced pressure on any single prey species. This helped keep the system balanced. An ecosystem with strong prey diversity helps predators thrive without destabilizing the population structure. The large sharks that eventually emerged did so because the food chain could support them. Their strong jaws and large teeth made them capable of hunting the largest prey available. Their muscles allowed them to travel across entire ocean basins. Their size gave them the endurance needed to follow prey over long distances. But even these giants relied on the balance maintained at the lower levels. If the plankton populations faltered, the entire food web would weaken. If medium-sized fish dwindled, the species that fed on them would suffer. If marine mammals declined, the giants themselves would lose their biggest food source. The food chains of the ancient oceans did not grow upward in a straight line. They branched out in many directions. Some species fed on multiple levels. Some predators were both hunters and scavengers. Some fish ate plankton when young but hunted other fish when mature. This branching created a flexible structure that could withstand gradual changes in climate or sea level. It also allowed life to recover from smaller disruptions without collapsing entirely. Drifting through the food chain also reveals how different species interacted indirectly. For example, when storms stirred the water and redistributed plankton, fish populations responded. When fish moved in response, marine mammals changed their routes. When marine mammals shifted direction, predators shifted as well. None of these interactions required conscious decision-making. They were the natural outcome of each species responding to the conditions that shaped their survival. The diversity of the middle and lower tiers made the ancient food chains especially resilient. Predators were not limited to a narrow list of prey. When one species declined, they could often switch to another. This adaptability supported the rise of large predators because it reduced the likelihood of food shortages. In modern oceans, some predators face scarcity because their prey populations are limited or vulnerable to disruptions. In the prehistoric warm oceans, the abundance at the lower levels provided a buffer against such scarcity. Even the seafloor played a role in the food chain. Scavengers fed on decaying matter that drifted down from the upper layers. These scavengers supported the nutrient cycling process by breaking down organic material that would otherwise accumulate. Their activity helped maintain the chemistry of the water. Nutrients released from this material eventually returned to the upper layers through upwelling. This constant recycling supported the growth of plankton and maintained the stability of the entire food chain. If you imagine following these food chains through the water, you might picture an early whale feeding near the surface. Below it, schools of fish move in coordinated patterns. Farther down, small drifting organisms feed on plankton. The water seems full of movement at every level. Even in deeper regions where light fades, life continues. Predators pass through these layers, not always to feed, but sometimes to travel or seek cooler waters. Every movement reflects the structure of the food chain beneath it. The colossal sharks that eventually rose to the top of these food chains did not dominate through constant conflict. Their strength came from the quiet stability of the ocean. They thrived because the lower levels of the food chain never faltered for long. They grew large because their prey grew large. They travelled far because the ecosystem supported wide-ranging movement. Their presence was the natural outcome of a food web functioning at full capacity. The more you move through this ancient world, the clearer it becomes that the food chains were built on cooperation as much as competition. Not intentional cooperation, but cooperation through structure. Each species relied on the movement of others. Each depended on the ocean's steady rhythms. Each contributed to the cycle of growth and decay. And all of these interactions created an environment where giant predators could thrive without pushing the system out of balance. As we continue through this world, the next layers of the story reveal even more about how these creatures lived alongside countless others, sharing the same seas shaped by the movements and feeding patterns that had been in place long before the giants themselves appeared. The oceans that supported the rise of the giant sharks were not only defined by the movement of water or the abundance of life, they were shaped just as strongly by the structures hidden beneath the surface. These structures formed the quiet framework that shaped entire ecosystems. They guided currents, influenced migration routes, determined where nutrients gathered, and carved out regions where specific species could thrive. Understanding this silent architecture helps explain not only why certain animals flourished, but also how predators as large as the ancient sharks found the conditions necessary to survive. If you picture the prehistoric ocean floor, the first thing to understand is that it was far from flat. Even though water covers these features, the seafloor had mountains, valleys, ridges, plateaus, and trenches shaped by millions of years of geological movement. These formations developed slowly, pushed upward or pulled downward by the shifting plates that made up Earth's crust. Over time, they created a map of the deep that shaped the lives of everything above it. Some of the most important structures were the long underwater mountain ranges called mid-ocean ridges. These ridges stretched across vast distances, separating ocean basins and influencing the direction of major currents. When warm water moved across one side of a ridge, it often turned or slowed, redirecting itself into new paths. When colder, denser water travelled near these formations, it could be guided downward. These subtle shifts created predictable corridors for migrating animals. Early whales, large fish, and even smaller species often travelled along these pathways, not because they understood them, but because the water's movement made those routes easier. And wherever prey travelled in predictable paths, the giants followed. The ridges also released heat through volcanic activity. In some regions, underwater vents poured mineral-rich water into the surrounding areas. Although these areas supported life in later ages as well, during the warm periods dominated by large sharks, they contributed to nutrient cycling in ways that remained stable for long stretches. The rising plumes of warm water helped stimulate localized growth of plankton and other microorganisms. Even though these activity centers were small compared to the vastness of the ocean, they influenced local productivity. Animals that fed near these sites benefited from the increased availability of food, and predators learned, through instinctive patterns, to visit these regions. Far below the surface, deep ocean trenches formed the opposite kind of structure. These narrow, elongated depressions sank thousands of meters into the Earth's crust. While giant sharks did not inhabit the deepest parts of these trenches, the existence of the trenches helped shape the ocean's thermal structure. Cold, dense water collected in these depths, spreading outward along the bottom of the basins. As the water travelled, it absorbed nutrients from decaying organisms that drifted down. When this nutrient-rich water later rose through upwelling, it fueled plankton growth closer to the surface. In this way, the deepest parts of the ocean influenced the life at the very top of the food chain, without the animals ever travelling into those depths. Between the ridges and trenches were vast underwater plains that stretched across large sections of the seafloor. These plains rarely attracted attention because they seemed empty compared to the edges of continents or shallow coastal zones. But these broad areas served as resting grounds for drifting sediments and decaying matter, helping store nutrients that would later be redistributed through the ocean's circulation. The stability of these plains, formed over millions of years, contributed to the long-term health of the ecosystem. Closer to the continents, the architecture of the prehistoric seas became more varied. Continental shelves, wide stretches of shallow water, formed along the edges of land masses. In warm periods, many shelves extended farther than they do today because sea levels were higher. These shallow regions received abundant sunlight, allowing plants, algae, and plankton to thrive. They also served as important feeding grounds for fish and marine mammals. With so much life concentrated in shallow areas, predators often patrolled the edges where shallow water met deeper zones. These boundaries created some of the most active regions in the ecosystem, not because the predators forced the activity, but because the structure of the environment funneled life into those zones naturally. As the ocean floor sloped downward from the shelves, it formed continental slopes, steep regions where depth changed rapidly. These slopes funneled water downward, carrying oxygen and nutrients into deeper zones. They also created thermal boundaries where warm surface waters met colder layers. Many species use these boundaries to regulate their temperature or find prey. Large sharks likely moved along these temperature changes, taking advantage of the differences in water conditions to locate animals that preferred certain layers. Another important feature of the ancient ocean architecture was the presence of underwater plateaus. These elevated regions, often created by old volcanic activity, rose from the sea floor like submerged islands. Some reached close enough to the surface to affect the movement of currents. Others remained far beneath the light but still influenced how water flowed around them. These plateaus altered the distribution of nutrients and sometimes created small ecosystems unique to their shape. Fish populations often congregated in these areas, providing feeding opportunities for predators that passed through. Beyond the large dramatic formations, the smaller details of the seafloor played a role as well. Soft sediments created regions where bottom-dwelling organisms thrived. Harder rocky outcrops offered hiding spots for species that needed shelter. Shell fragments, mineral deposits, and coral structures contributed to the variety of habitats available. These habitats shaped the behavior of many species in the lower and middle tiers of the food chain. When these species gathered in an area, predators eventually followed. The architecture of the ancient seas also included coastal features shaped by slow erosion. Rivers carried sediments into the ocean, building deltas and estuaries. Although these environments shifted over time, they provided nurseries for young fish and marine mammals during certain periods. The calm, shallow waters protected these young from many large predators, but as they grew and moved into open water, they entered the zones where larger predators dominated. The existence of these nursery zones helped maintain strong populations of prey species, which in turn supported the development of large predators. The silent structure of the ocean didn't only include the seafloor, it also included the water's internal architecture, layers of different temperatures, densities, and oxygen levels. Warm surface layers floated above cooler, denser layers. These layers rarely mixed unless external forces disturbed them. Predators and prey used these layers to their advantage. Some animals stayed in warm water to conserve energy. Others dipped into cooler layers to slow their metabolism or avoid competition. These layers created predictable vertical pathways that animals followed. A giant shark could patrol the boundary between two layers, sensing temperature changes that indicated the presence of prey. The distribution of oxygen shaped the architecture as well. In some prehistoric oceans, deep layers had limited oxygen, forming zones where only certain species could survive. These zones helped separate species that would otherwise compete too heavily with one another. They also guided the behavior of predators that moved between layers. By navigating these boundaries, large sharks could find prey that relied on certain oxygen levels. The structure of the water itself became part of their hunting strategy. Over time, the shape of the ocean floor shifted. Continental plates continued to drift. Mountains rose and eroded. Volcanoes built new ridges. The ocean adjusted to each change. But the overall structure remained stable enough for life to adapt. Animals evolved in ways that fit the environment. The largest predators developed strategies that aligned with the layout of the seas. Their travel routes matched the shape of the continents. Their hunting patterns aligned with the flow of currents. Their growth depended on the stability of the food sources shaped by the structure beneath them. Even the depths that predators never visited played a role in their survival. When decaying organisms sank to the ocean floor, they provided food for deep-sea creatures that broke them down. The nutrients released by this process were carried upward again by currents and upwelling. This constant cycle kept the surface waters productive. Without the recycling taking place in the deep, the upper layers could not have supported the massive plankton blooms that fed the rest of the food chain. The architecture also influenced how far animals could travel. Some regions of the ocean acted like natural roadways. Trenches and ridges created long, linear pathways that marine mammals and large sharks followed. These paths connected feeding grounds, breeding areas, and regions of stable temperature. Over generations, the movement along these paths became instinctive. The giants travelled along routes shaped not by choice, but by the form of the ocean itself. Where underwater mountains rose near the surface, they sometimes created shallow platforms that attracted prey. Marine mammals might rest in these areas or feed on the fish that congregated there. Large sharks learned that these platforms provided opportunities. They patrolled the edges where the seafloor dropped off sharply, waiting for prey to swim into deeper water. These interactions repeated for millions of years because the geological features remained stable. Some regions of the ancient oceans were shaped by volcanic activity that occurred intermittently. Underwater eruptions sometimes created new islands or expanded existing ones. As these islands eroded, they created new shallow regions that supported reef systems. These reef systems attracted fish, which attracted predators. Although the reefs in these prehistoric periods differed from modern coral reefs, their function was similar. They provided structure and habitat that supported large populations of prey species. The silent architecture of the oceans also included the chemical composition of the water. Mineral content influenced plant growth. Salinity affected how species moved across regions. Areas with unique chemical signatures sometimes supported specialized species that contributed to the food chain in ways not seen in modern oceans. These differences added complexity to the ecosystem, shaping the interactions between species and influencing which region supported the largest predators. If you imagine drifting across the prehistoric ocean floor, you would see a vast landscape mostly hidden from the surface. Mountains would rise gradually from the depths, their slopes covered in sediment. Ridges would stretch far into the distance, creating natural boundaries in the water above them. Deep trenches would cut into the seafloor like long scars shaped by ancient forces. Plateaus would sit quietly beneath the water, their broad surfaces forming platforms where life gathered. All of these features combined to shape the environment where giant sharks lived. The animals themselves never saw this architecture directly. They responded to its effects. When the water moved steadily along a ridge, prey followed. When nutrients rose near a slope, plankton multiplied. When marine mammals found safe calving areas near shallow shelves, predators learned to patrol nearby. Every part of the ecosystem was influenced by the shape of the ocean below. As the story continues, the next layers of this ancient world reveal how countless other creatures shared the water with the giants, each shaped by the same structures and movements that defined the prehistoric oceans. The giant sharks that once travelled through the ancient oceans did not swim through empty water. They lived among an enormous variety of creatures that filled every corner of the sea, each adapted to the conditions of their time. Some of these animals were large enough to be seen from far away. Others were so small or so hidden that even the biggest predators rarely encountered them directly. The prehistoric waters were crowded with life, even if that life occupied different layers, travelled at different speeds, or lived in regions far from the hunting paths of the giants. To understand what the oceans truly looked like during the reign of enormous sharks, it helps to move slowly through the creatures that shared the water with them, noticing how each one found a place in the vast and shifting world beneath the surface. Near the upper layers of the ocean, marine mammals dominated many areas. The early whales that roamed these waters did not resemble their modern relatives in every detail, but they played similar roles in the ecosystem. Some species were massive, moving through warm seas with slow confidence. Others were smaller and travelled in groups. Their bodies were shaped by long-distance swimming, steady breathing patterns, and the need to care for young in a world where large predators always waited at a distance. These mammals created predictable movement patterns in the ocean. They followed food across great distances, surfaced for air in regular intervals, and returned to certain regions year after year. The giants that hunted them were shaped by these habits, just as the mammals responded to the presence of the predators. Some of the earliest filter-feeding whales were also beginning to appear in these warm seas. Although they were not yet as large as the baleen whales that exist today, their feeding strategies allowed them to consume vast quantities of small organisms. They travelled through plankton-rich regions, filtering water through their mouths and collecting enough food to sustain their large bodies. Their presence added another layer to the food web. Predators rarely targeted the largest filter feeders, but the existence of these mammals helped shape plankton distribution. When these animals passed through a region, the small organisms that made up their diet became temporarily less abundant, encouraging fish and other species to move to areas where plankton levels remained high. In deeper regions of the ocean, large squid-like creatures drifted through the water. Some of them had bodies shaped for rapid movement, allowing them to dart quickly to avoid predators. Others relied on camouflage or subtle movement to stay hidden. These animals played an important role in connecting the upper and lower layers of the sea. They fed on smaller drifting organisms and sometimes on fish, then became prey for both sharks and marine mammals. The presence of squid created another food source for medium and large predators, helping diversify the diets of species that lived in these waters. Fish of all sizes filled the middle layers of the prehistoric seas. Some species were large, powerful swimmers that travelled in long-distance schools. Their movements created patterns in the water that predators could follow. Other species were slower and more solitary, relying on their shape or coloration to avoid being seen. Many fish fed on plankton or smaller animals, transferring energy upward through the food chain. Some species developed thick armour-like scales that protected them against the bites of the medium predators. Others developed sleek bodies that allowed them to accelerate quickly to avoid danger. These fish played a crucial role in supporting the structure of the ecosystem. Without them, the predators above and the smaller animals below would not have maintained their populations. Some fish species grew to impressive sizes themselves. Although they were not as large as the giant sharks, they represented significant prey for other predators. These large fish occupied specific regions, often near underwater mountains or nutrient-rich zones created by upwelling. Their presence in these areas added diversity to the feeding opportunities for animals that passed through. Marine mammals might feed on them when available. Medium-sized sharks might focus their hunting around regions where these large fish gathered. The existence of such prey contributed to the cycle that allowed the giants to grow to enormous sizes. When an ecosystem offers multiple layers of large and reliable prey, the predators that depend on that ecosystem receive enough energy to maintain large bodies. Along the sea floor, bottom-dwelling creatures lived in environments far removed from the fast-moving world near the surface. Some of these animals were ancient relatives of modern crustaceans, equipped with hard shells and jointed legs. They scavenged for food among rocks, coral structures and sediment. Because they fed on decaying material that drifted downward, they played an essential role in recycling nutrients. Other bottom dwellers included star-shaped organisms that moved slowly across the seafloor, feeding on organic particles or small animals. Their slow movements had little effect on the larger predators above, but their presence contributed to the stability of the marine system. Soft-bodied animals also lived near the seafloor. These creatures often buried themselves in sediment, emerging only when food drifted near. They provided nourishment for bigger bottom-dwelling predators that had adapted to life without sunlight. Although they lived far from the paths of giant sharks, these animals influenced the broader ecosystem by contributing to nutrient cycling. When they fed and reproduced, they maintained a steady supply of organic material for the decomposers below and the plankton above. In regions where underwater volcanic activity shaped the environment, unique species thrived in conditions that might seem harsh by modern standards. These creatures lived near vents where mineral-rich water entered the ocean. Their bodies were adapted to handle chemical conditions that would challenge many other species. Although such environments existed deep below the range of the giants, they still contributed to the health of the entire ecosystem. The nutrients released from these vents influenced the growth of plankton and other small organisms near the surface. Not all creatures in the prehistoric seas fit easily into specific categories. Many evolved unusual shapes or behaviors that allowed them to survive in the warm, nutrient-rich waters. Some species drifted with the currents, using thin, delicate structures to float. They captured small particles of food with appendages that resembled tiny nets. Others used bioluminescence to attract prey in deeper water. While the giant sharks did not interact directly with many of these smaller animals, the presence of such species enriched the ecosystem, contributing to the overall stability that allowed large predators to exist. Marine reptiles still existed in certain periods, although they were far less dominant than they had been in earlier ages. Some species lingered in shallow regions, moving slowly through the water in search of food. Their size and behavior varied, but they were no longer the largest predators in the ocean. The rise of marine mammals and the success of large sharks changed the balance of these ecosystems. The reptiles that remained adapted to smaller niches, becoming part of the middle layers of the food chain rather than dominating the top. Among the creatures that shared the water with the giants were those that used the structure of the seafloor for protection. Some species hid among rocky outcrops or coral-like formations. Others burrowed into sand or mud. These hidden animals avoided larger predators by remaining out of sight. Their survival strategies contributed to the diversity of the ecosystem, providing prey for species that specialized in hunting near the seafloor. Even creatures that rarely moved, such as certain filter feeders attached to underwater surfaces, played important roles in the ecosystem. They captured small particles drifting in the water, helping maintain clarity and balance in regions where they lived. Their presence supported the stability of the lower tiers, which in turn supported the middle and upper tiers. If you imagine travelling slowly through the water during this time, you would notice how each species occupied its own space. Some swam near the surface where sunlight touched the water. Others drifted lazily in the dim layers below. Some hid along the seafloor. Some travelled in fast-moving schools. Each organism acted according to its own needs, shaped by millions of years of adaptation to the structure of the ancient oceans. As you continue to picture this world, the sheer variety becomes more apparent. Every niche was filled with life. The smallest drifting organisms multiplied endlessly. The medium-sized fish roamed in complex patterns. The marine mammals travelled long distances in familiar routes. The squid and other cephalopods adapted to both hunting and hiding. The crustaceans and bottom dwellers kept the seafloor active with movement. Even the deep-sea species far out of view contributed nutrients to the layers above. All of these creatures shared the water with the giant sharks in a way that made the ecosystem functional. The giants did not dominate every moment. They existed as part of a larger system. Their survival depended on the presence of prey at many levels. Their growth depended on the abundance of marine mammals. Their movement depended on the predictability of migrations shaped by the structure of the ocean. Their presence influenced other species, but they were shaped just as strongly by those species. When thinking about the hidden creatures of this world, it becomes clear that the giant sharks were not the only remarkable animals in their environment. The seas were full of life that operated quietly, consistently, and often invisibly. Without these smaller or less noticeable creatures, the oceans could not have supported predators of such immense size. The stability of the ecosystem required every layer, every niche, and every movement. As the story continues, the world around these giants deepens further, revealing how the conditions that allowed them to thrive eventually changed, shaping the path toward their decline and the shifting structure of the ancient oceans. The enormous sharks that once moved confidently through the warm, prehistoric oceans did not vanish all at once. Their disappearance came slowly, shaped by a series of changes that unfolded over millions of years. These changes were not abrupt shocks, but long transitions that altered the balance of the ocean step by step. The giants did not fail because of a single event. They faded because the world around them shifted into a form that no longer supported their size, their habits, or the food sources they depended on. To understand their decline, it helps to move slowly through the forces that shape the ocean as it changed, noticing how each shift influenced the next, until the giants finally disappeared from the water. The first major influence came from the climate. The warm oceans that had once supported such impressive growth began to cool. This cooling did not happen quickly. It happened over extended periods driven by changes in the arrangement of the continents, the flow of ocean currents, and the amount of heat the Earth absorbed. As the continents drifted, they altered the pathways that warm water once followed freely. New barriers formed, narrow passages closed, channels that had once carried heat across large distances began to restrict the flow. As these patterns shifted, the oceans gradually developed stronger temperature differences between regions. Colder water collected in areas that had once been warm. The warm water routes used by marine mammals narrowed. Regions that had supported year-round feeding became seasonal instead. Animals that relied on stable warmth began adjusting their movements. Prey species started changing their distribution, shifting into different layers of the ocean, or moving into new areas where temperatures remained comfortable. These changes did not harm the giants immediately. They adapted where they could, but the slow cooling marked the beginning of a trend that would continue for millions of years. The next influence came from the shifting positions of the continents. As land masses collided or separated, they created new coastlines, new shallow waters, and new deep basins. Some regions that had once been ideal feeding grounds for marine mammals became cut off from warm currents. Other regions developed stronger currents that carried colder water into places where warm water species had once thrived. These slow geological changes altered the structure of the food web. The energy flowing through the lower levels of the ocean began to shift, and the steady supply of large prey that the giants depended on slowly declined. Another important factor was the rise of new predators and competitors. As marine mammals diversified, some species developed more advanced behaviours, stronger social structures, and greater ability to defend themselves. Early forms of orcas and other toothed whales appeared, bringing a kind of coordinated hunting that older ecosystems had not seen before. These predators did not directly threaten the larger sharks at first. The giants were still capable of overpowering almost anything they encountered. But over long spans of time, these new predators began competing for the same prey. Marine mammals that once moved in predictable patterns now changed their habits in response to new threats. They began developing defensive group behaviours that helped them reduce losses to predators. When prey animals alter their movement in large-scale ways, the predators that depend on them must adjust as well. The giants, built for endurance and power rather than manoeuvrability or rapid adaptation, could follow these shifting patterns for a while, but their ability to adjust had limits. The cooling oceans also influenced the lower levels of the food chain. Plankton populations changed in composition. Some species that thrived in warm conditions declined, while others more suited to cooler water expanded. The distribution of nutrients shifted as currents changed. In some areas, productivity increased. In others, it decreased. These shifts affected fish populations, which in turn affected the marine mammals. Even small changes in the lower tiers of the food chain can influence the entire system. Over time, these gradual shifts contributed to a slow decline in the large marine mammals that had once been abundant in the warm seas. With fewer prey available, the giants faced increasing challenges. As cooling intensified in certain periods, the oceans developed stronger layers of temperature differences. Warm surface water sat above colder, deeper layers that did not mix easily. These layers limited the movement of some prey species and influenced where nutrients could rise to the surface. Productivity in the surface waters became more seasonal. Some regions that had once supported life year-round became active only during certain times of the year. Predators that relied on regular access to prey began facing long periods of scarcity. The giants had large energy demands. They required consistent feeding opportunities to maintain their size. They could survive occasional shortages, but they could not endure long stretches of reduced prey availability. As the oceans continued cooling, the periods of scarcity became more frequent. Marine mammal populations fluctuated more dramatically. The stability that had once supported enormous predators weakened. Another influence came from the growth of ice at the poles. Ice formation in polar regions created stronger temperature gradients in the ocean. The presence of ice also influenced the salinity of seawater, which changed the density and movement of currents. These shifts further altered the paths that marine mammals used to migrate. Many mammals adapted by moving into new regions. The giants followed, but the changing routes were not always favourable for large predators that relied on warm conditions. As prey animals moved into colder waters, the sharks were pushed to their physiological limits. Large sharks can tolerate a range of temperatures, but extreme cold affects their metabolism. When giant sharks entered cooler regions, their bodies slowed. Their hunting efficiency decreased. They could follow prey into cold waters for short periods, but they could not remain there indefinitely. As prey increasingly moved into colder regions, the giants were forced to remain in warmer areas where prey became less abundant. This separation between predator and prey stressed the population of the giants over long stretches of time. Competition from new predators increased as well. Some toothed whales became highly organised hunters. Their ability to communicate and coordinate attacks gave them advantages in certain environments. They adapted more readily to changing temperatures and shifting migrations. Their presence created pressure on the same prey the giants needed. Although the giant sharks remained formidable, the combination of cooling waters, shifting prey movement, and competition made survival harder. As marine mammals continued adapting to the cooler oceans, some species became faster and more agile. Their improved speed helped them evade slower predators. Others developed stronger defensive strategies. Some travelled in larger groups. Some changed calving grounds to more protected regions. These behavioural shifts reduced the chances that large sharks could capture them reliably. Even predators with powerful jaws and massive bodies need consistent success to survive. As prey became harder to catch, the giants faced growing challenges. All of these changes happened gradually. No single event eliminated the giants. Instead, the environment slowly drifted away from the conditions that once supported them. Cooling continued, prey populations declined, new predators gained strength, currents shifted. The routes that had once offered abundant food grew unpredictable. The giants adapted where possible, but each adjustment only worked for a limited time. Over generations, their population weakened. Another factor that contributed to their decline was the shift from warm, wide oceans to oceans with more restricted warm regions. As warm water became confined to smaller areas, the habitats suitable for these sharks shrank. They once travelled across vast distances following prey through warm corridors. When those corridors narrowed, the giants were forced into smaller regions where resources were limited. This increased competition among individuals, putting additional stress on the population. At the same time, sea levels changed. In some periods, sea levels dropped, exposing regions that had once been shallow nurseries or feeding grounds. Coastal areas that supported young marine mammals or provided safe zones shifted dramatically. These changes affected both prey and predators. The giants lost important regions that once supported their life cycle. Even if these areas still held water, the temperature, depth, or nutrient availability might have changed enough to reduce their usefulness. As the climate continued its slow transition, the diversity of large marine mammals declined in many areas. The species that remained often preferred cooler waters than the giants could tolerate. The warming and cooling cycles of the Earth had happened many times before, but during this particular cooling phase, the combination of geological shifts, new predators, and changing ecosystems created a pattern that prevented the giant sharks from maintaining their dominance. The disappearance of these sharks did not happen uniformly across the planet. Some regions lost their populations earlier than others. In certain warmer areas, the giants may have survived longer, following the last remnants of ancient migration routes. But eventually the global conditions no longer supported them. Their numbers dwindled as their food sources declined, and as the ocean continued shifting away from the warm, stable environment that once allowed them to grow to extraordinary sizes. In the final stages of their existence, the giants likely lived in fragmented populations. They moved through familiar waters but found fewer opportunities to feed. Their young faced greater risks as prey became scarcer and competition increased. Over time, the number of individuals capable of reaching adulthood dropped. The large predators that had once crossed entire oceans with confidence gradually faded from the ecosystem. Their disappearance left room for other species to expand. Toothed whales became more dominant in many regions. New species of sharks evolved to fill different ecological roles. The ocean did not empty when the giants vanished. It simply shifted into a new form, shaped by the same forces that had once created the conditions for the giants in the first place. Change continued, as it always does in the long history of the Earth. Understanding this slow disappearance helps explain why such enormous creatures could thrive for millions of years and then eventually vanish. Their extinction was not the result of weakness. It was the natural outcome of long-term changes that gradually reshaped their world. And as we continue, these changes lead us toward the present, revealing how the ancient oceans eventually gave way to the ones we know today, carrying hints of a past that once supported creatures of incredible scale. The world that once carried giant sharks and the oceans that supported their vast movements now feel impossibly distant compared to the waters we know today. Yet the connection between those ancient seas and the present shoreline is not broken. It stretches across millions of years through the gradual shaping of the planet, the slow rise and fall of climates, and the steady evolution of the species that replaced the giants. To understand how we arrived at the modern ocean, it helps to walk carefully from the past to the present, recognizing the long chain of changes that redesigned the water, the life within it, and the patterns that continue to shape the sea we stand beside today. If you imagine the last of the giant sharks fading from the ancient warm seas, the world around them was already shifting into a new form. The currents that once carried heat across entire ocean basins were narrowing. The migration routes that supported marine mammals were changing in response. The prey that had once sustained enormous predators was evolving into species better suited to cooler climates and different feeding strategies. None of these changes happened quickly, but each played a part in building the oceans that exist now. The climate continued its long cooling trend, influenced by the drifting of continents and the formation of new mountain ranges. As land masses shifted farther apart or collided into new shapes, the pathways for ocean currents changed again. Channels that once allowed warm water to move freely began to close. New coastlines emerged. The distribution of sunlight across the planet shifted subtly as land and water absorbed heat differently. These slow adjustments reshaped currents, altered wind patterns, and created new regions where temperatures varied more dramatically. As cold water began spreading across the oceans, the habits of marine mammals changed further. Some species adapted to cooler environments by developing thicker layers of fat. Others evolved new hunting methods that involved diving deeper or coordinating more efficiently with members of their group. As these mammals moved into colder regions, the structure of the food chain changed. Fish species that preferred warm water declined in many areas, replaced by species better suited to cooler temperatures. Plankton populations adjusted to new conditions as well, favouring types that thrived in colder, nutrient-rich waters. These shifts contributed to building the modern ocean, which is defined by strong temperature gradients, complex current systems, and a much wider variety of climates than existed during the warm ages. The steady cooling also allowed ice to accumulate in the polar regions. As glaciers grew, they influenced sea levels across the planet. During certain periods, large amounts of water became trapped in ice, causing sea levels to drop. This exposed areas that had once been shallow coastal zones or continental shelves. These newly exposed regions shaped the development of coastal ecosystems, creating environments where land animals evolved differently than their ancient counterparts. When ice melted during warmer periods, sea levels rose again, flooding these exposed regions and creating new coastlines. This rise and fall happened many times. With each shift, the ocean adjusted its structure. Some areas became deeper, others became shallower. Species that relied on specific depths or temperatures migrated accordingly. Over millions of years, these changes produced the coastlines that eventually became familiar to humans. As the climate and geography shifted, the composition of life in the ocean changed too. The disappearance of the giant sharks left openings in the ecosystem that other predators filled over time. Some toothed whales grew larger and more specialized in response to available prey. Other shark species evolved into new forms that succeeded in different environments. Some grew smaller and more agile. Others became apex predators in the regions they inhabited, but none approached the size of the giants that had once dominated the warm oceans. Fish species diversified significantly during this period. As currents developed stronger patterns, fish evolved to match their environments. Some species became long-distance swimmers capable of travelling across entire oceans. Others remained in specific regions, adapting to unique feeding opportunities created by upwelling, coastal nutrients, or deep-sea environments. The oceans grew more layered as temperatures varied more sharply between the surface and deeper water. This vertical layering created new habitats that supported more species than before. The development of the modern polar regions had a profound impact on the ocean structure. Cold, dense water began sinking in specific regions, particularly in the far north and far south. This sinking water drove global circulation patterns that connected the surface to the deep ocean in new ways. The movement of this cold water helped pull nutrients from the deep to the surface in some areas while isolating deep waters in others. These changes created the modern patterns of nutrient distribution that support today's ocean productivity. As these circulation changes continued, some marine mammals became highly specialized for cold water environments. Seals, sea lions, and certain whales adapted to thrive in icy conditions. They developed new hunting strategies, new body shapes, and new social behaviors. The food chains in these regions became distinct from those in warmer areas. The modern ocean became divided into zones defined by temperature, light levels, and nutrient availability. This division created a far more complex set of ecosystems than the warm prehistoric oceans once supported. The seafloor continued evolving as well. Continental plates shifted, creating new underwater mountains and trenches. Volcanic activity built islands and plateaus. Sediments from rivers accumulated in some regions, changing the depth and composition of the water. Coral reefs developed in tropical regions, providing habitats for thousands of species. These reefs played a major role in shaping coastal ecosystems. They supported fish populations that attracted predators. They stabilized coastlines and contributed to nutrient cycling. As life became more diverse, the connections between species grew more intricate. Modern ecosystems form through interactions between predators, prey, and plants. In warm regions, coral reefs, mangrove forests, and seagrass beds supported complex food webs. In colder regions, sea ice played a major role in shaping life. Algae that grew under the ice supported small crustaceans, which fed fish, which fed larger predators. These layered interactions replaced the simpler structure of the ancient warm oceans. The movement of tides became more significant as coastlines shifted. Tidal zones created environments where species adapted to alternating periods of water coverage and exposure. Over time, these areas became home to organisms that could survive rapidly changing conditions. The intertidal regions became some of the most diverse ecosystems on the planet, supporting species that contributed to broader ocean health. One of the most significant changes in the modern ocean came from the evolution of large baleen whales. These whales developed enormous body sizes that surpassed even the largest of the ancient sharks. But their feeding strategies were entirely different. Instead of hunting large mammals, they consumed vast quantities of tiny organisms, relying on the abundance of plankton and small fish in cold, nutrient-rich regions. The appearance of these whales changed the dynamics of the ocean again. Their long migrations affected nutrient distribution. Their feeding contributed to stirring surface waters. Their presence altered the balance of food webs across large distances. The evolution of modern marine predators also shaped the present ocean. Toothed whales became more specialized, developing echolocation and complex social structures. Sharks diversified into a wide range of species. Some became fast, agile hunters. Others developed unique feeding strategies. Some evolved to live near reefs. Others inhabited the deep ocean or open water. None reached the size of the ancient giants, but many became dominant in their own environments. Over millions of years, the ocean grew increasingly interconnected with life on land. Rivers carried nutrients into the sea. Coastal plants stabilized shorelines. Birds relied on marine fish. Even the chemical composition of the atmosphere influenced ocean chemistry. These connections grew stronger as the Earth continued shaping itself into the world we recognize today. As humans eventually appeared, they encountered a coastline already shaped by countless geological cycles. The waters they saw were cooler, more dynamic, and more diverse than the warm oceans that once supported the giant sharks. The species they discovered were adapted to a world with ice at the poles, strong seasonal variations, and deep layers of nutrient-rich water. The ocean they entered was the result of millions of years of steady change. Yet even with all these transformations, traces of the ancient world remain in the present shoreline. Fossilized teeth from the giant sharks still wash up on beaches, reminding people that the water once carried predators far larger than anything alive today. Certain migration routes still reflect patterns shaped by ancient continents and currents. The structure of the seafloor continues to influence the movement of modern currents. Some species preserve ancient traits that connect them to distant ancestors. Standing at the edge of the present ocean, it becomes possible to see how the past shaped the world we know. The gentle movement of waves carries the imprint of long-forgotten currents. The presence of marine mammals reflects evolutionary paths shaped by ancient climates. The diversity of fish mirrors the branching patterns that developed when the oceans cooled. Even the distribution of coral reefs and kelp forests can be traced back to changes that followed the disappearance of the giants. The shoreline today represents the continuation of a story that began long before its first grains of sand formed. The water that reaches the coast has travelled through currents shaped by underwater structures millions of years old. The winds that move across the ocean carry patterns influenced by continents that drifted slowly into their present shapes. The marine life that approaches the shallows carries genes shaped by ancient selection, survival, and extinction. And even though the giant sharks no longer swim through these waters, the modern ocean still reflects the conditions that once supported them. When warm periods return in limited cycles, certain species expand their ranges. When cold currents strengthen, others retreat or adapt. The ocean continues to shift, slowly reshaping itself in ways that mirror the long patterns of the past. As we step from the ancient seas to the present shoreline, the continuity becomes clearer. The modern ocean is not separate from the prehistoric one. It is simply a later version of the same system, reshaped, cooled, reorganized, and filled with new life. It still moves, breathes, and shifts according to the same forces that guided the water millions of years ago. The story continues from here, carrying the same steady unfolding that shaped the rise of the giants, their long reign, their slow disappearance, and the world that followed.